Hello, my name is James Underhill and I work with the Rouen Ethno-Linguistics Project in the north of France. And I've come from Europe to speak with one of the great linguists of our times, Professor Anna Wierzbicka, who's from Poland but who's spent the last 30, 40 years here in Australia National University. You've published a lot of books on language and culture, Anna, and one of the last ones was Imprisoned in English. How are we imprisoned in English, in your opinion?
Well, I have to answer the question with another question. What do we mean by we? Who are we? If you by we you mean the speakers of English, well, then I would say that everybody, speakers of all languages, if they don't have knowledge and competence in other languages, experience with other languages, they are imprisoned in their own language. So this is not anything special about speakers of English. But there is a special problem with speakers of English, because English now in particular, that it is such a global language, the somehow assumption arises that it's a special language, that you can speak English with people around the world and that you will not be imprisoned in your own language like in any other language, but that it's a global international language. And that's a big mistake. And that's because it's a language of science, language of humanities, language of international relations now, and so on. And the idea or the impression that English somehow is different, that it's transparent. It's just the pure language of human reason and communication. So that's what I really deplore most. Not that ordinary speakers of English are imprisoned in English, because that's normal, but that scholars, and scholars in humanities, including linguists, anthropologists, and sociologists, and psychologists, and so on, who speak English, they imagine that they are not, that they can rely on English concepts, and that somehow this applies to all humans around the world. I think that's the tremendous danger.
Okay, so the problem is how we think. These books like How We Think in Language, and the question of talking about, are we a monolingual or a multilingual? You speak several languages, so you're able to move into different languages. You're criticizing the fact that some people are limited to a monolingual view of the world that they think is universal. Is that your...
Well, no. My complaint is about scholars, not about ordinary people. But when scholars imagine that they can use English words to capture universal human experience because English is somehow special, international, and so on, that's the great danger. Well, I can give you some examples. Well, for example, when we talk about, I just had a discussion recently with a colleague, we talk about kinship, relations, families. This is very important for people all around the world. So many people think, and that's a long tradition in anthropology and linguistics, that you can talk about siblings. This is older sibling, younger sibling, and that you can analyze terminology, kin terminology in different languages using these English words. Sibling, brother, sister, parents, and so on. And I say, well, look, in these languages there are no such words, including Polish. There's no word for sibling in Polish. But so if you want to describe how people, speakers of Polish, think about kin terms, then you should not, in my view, rely on the English word sibling, because this doesn't correspond to any psychological reality of speakers of Polish. But the people who are working in this tradition of analyzing kinship through English terms don't believe it. They think, well, look, sibling is just so important. It's so it's so necessary. You can look at talk to speakers of any languages, and you can see that you can capture their social cognition in terms of sibling, parent, and so on. And I say, no. If you really want to understand how these people think, you have to rely on words which they have, which have equivalence in their own language. For example, mother and father. You can talk about kinship terminology in any language using the words mother and father, because all languages, as evidence suggests, do have words for mother and father.
So mother and father are universal.
Mother and father are universal, yeah, but sibling is not, and even brother and sister are not, because they are languages which distinguish, well, what in English you would call older brother and younger brother, but certainly not sibling. But you have this sort of blind spot that since sibling works so well for scholars working through English, then you can really rely on it.
Okay then, so that leads me to our second question. What do we share what you're still interested in universals. This is an important part. I mean, there are two basic trends in linguistics. One that's going to stress diversity and the neo-Whorfians, and they're really not going to be, for most of them, they're not particularly interested in universals. On the other hand, you have the Chomskyan idea of universals and universal grammar. What's interesting, what strikes me as really fundamental and important about your work is that you're navigating between the two schools, trying to carve out something solid, reliable, but linguistically informed. So what can we share and what can we translate? Mother and father, for example?
Mother and father, yeah.
What else?
Well, but I think, just returning to your more general point, is you cannot describe diversity without looking at what is universal at the same time. Because how will you describe diversity? This brings us back to the idea of being imprisoned in English. If you want to describe human diversity through English concept, that everything will be skewed. You will be describing that diversity not from the point of view of speakers of diverse languages, but through your English glasses. So you can only, in my view, describe and capture human diversity if you have a meta-language, if you have something shared, a common measure that you can apply to all of them, including English, but without privileging English.
Okay, so that's the whole principle behind your universal primes, your 65 translatable terms. Can you give me a few more examples? We have mother, father. What other examples would you put in the universal?
Well, many people, my colleagues and I have worked for decades on many different languages, so it's an empirical program.
This is important.
And as a result of these empirical investigations conducted by many people in many different countries, we have come to the conclusion that there are at least 65 concepts which you can find in all languages as words or word-like elements. And that this is, and we believe that if this really captures a sort of shared conceptual, human conceptual core. So beginning with someone and something, you and I, good and bad, big and small, and then know, to think, to feel, to want, to do, to happen. These are concepts which you find in any language. So that's the basis, I think, of human communication.
So is this what you would call, in an article you published in 2011, the common language of all people that you're trying to strive to find?
Yes. Yeah, well, I like this term. I mean, we use a number of different terms, but I like particularly basic human. This corresponds to, as you know, Leibniz's idea that there's an alphabet of human thoughts. And I think that these 65 concepts which we have identified through empirical cross-linguistic work, they identify sort of human vocabulary, the vocabulary, conceptual vocabulary, which is realized in different ways in different languages.
So we would call this the innate language of thought in one of your phrases that you have?
Well, that's the vocabulary. You also need the syntax, because you can't have language with just a vocabulary. So we have also worked over decades on the combinations, on syntax of these 65 syntax, which would again be applicable to all languages.
Do you see linguists as transforming the English language, or pushing back the limits of English language when you talk about the way English concepts or Anglo concepts can't catch the meaning of foreign experience? Do you see other languages helping English, or the English worldview is developing?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question, but the point is not that that English doesn't have enough to capture the experience of other people. English has too much, because there's a very rich conceptual vocabulary in English which reflects the history and culture of speakers of English.
Okay,
and you can't really easily get out of those when and that's why people project this onto other languages, and they assume, for example, that every language must have words like right and wrong, because speakers of English can't think about the world and about human life without right and wrong. They wouldn't believe, they don't want to believe that other languages don't have words for right and wrong, but they don't. They have words for good and bad, but not for right and wrong.
Okay then, so right and wrong, you're getting into moral questions. These are beyond simply conceptual questions. We're often thinking in terms of the brain and cognition, but here you're getting into a moral level. Is thinking and feeling then shaped by language? Do you see language as something fundamental, shaping the worldview and the way we think and feel? Or is it our culture that shapes experience? Do you see a distinction there or a causal effect?
Well, I think the language we think in colors and shapes and influences hugely how we perceive the world.
Okay.
But, returning to this phrase, imprisoned in English, we don't have to be imprisoned in any particular language, because we have those shared fundamental concepts, the 65, and if you really try to think in terms of those, then you can liberate yourself.
Okay, so you see, this is a crucial question that I've had great difficulty getting to grips with. You see NSM, natural semantics meta-language, as a way of escaping from the limits of English, and not simply the limits of this, not simply by simplifying, but by getting rid of or putting to one side the prejudices or the history or the culture or the richness of English, and getting back to something basic and shared. Is that?
Yes. Well, let me give you an example. I'm very interested in, I've developed something that I call the Charter of Global Ethics, with maybe a grand name. But there are people in different disciplines who have worked for a very long time on trying to develop some kind of ethical consensus for humanity. And I respect this search very much. But as I looked at what they propose, I can see that they are proposing certain universal human norms formulated in terms of English concepts. What I've tried to do is to formulate universal human norms, or something which could be at least a basis for discussion about universal human norms, which is formulated in shared concepts. And so, for example, two basic norms which I would propose for discussion. It is good if someone wants to do good things for other people. It is bad if someone wants to do bad things to other people. Do you agree or not? Well, we can discuss it, but the question can be formulated in any language. And I sent my paper about it to a very prominent person in the field, Professor Sally King, who's a professor of Buddhist studies. And I said, and she said, well, look, that's something which was troubling me all my life, that we are talking about this global ethics, but using English concepts. And now I can see that you can really go outside it. So I was extremely gratified by her response.
So we really have been moving beyond simple ways of thinking into ways of feeling, into moral things. Jack Wong, in one of the books that one of the more personal books that you wrote with your daughter about living in language, Jack Wong talks about very few people in Singapore getting depressed, and he's interested in the very concept of depression as an Anglo concept or an Anglo reality. Is then depression a cultural, a linguistic phenomenon? How would you conceive of that in natural semantics meta-language?
We have written a lot about it, about depression. Yeah, I mean, obviously the concept is an English concept, modern English concept. And actually I've got one psychiatrist on the side, Christopher Dowling, who's a psychiatrist in London, and he published a book called, I think, Depression, where he does refer to NSM and how helpful it is in trying to communicate about people's mental health in multicultural and multilingual London. Because when medical professionals in a place like London try to talk about immigrants about depression, usually there's a wall of misunderstanding, non-understanding. People don't know what they're talking about. But when you get down to, how you think, do you think I don't want to live anymore, or do you think I feel something very bad all the time, or nothing good can ever happen to me, then they can tell you, and you get a common language, Well,
thank you very much, Professor Wierzbicka.
Thank you.